How helpful can you be?
Mr. Chair, Dr. Mathern, the department has done that in years past with data drill downs. In the past few years, because of COVID and post-COVID, that has kind of tapered off. Kind of our push for this next year with the system of support is to start bringing that back, especially with the not meeting and partially meeting. So there's an internal team being established by Beth Laugy, amongst others, that we're really going to start focusing on those schools and going back out and start looking at data, start looking at processes and looking at all that. So it's not only special ed, it's looking at basically assisting the schools wherever we can in that area.
And one last follow-up, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. Thank you. Another thing you said, Mike, that I think struck me just as you said it, and that is that, the whole accountability model actually is helping us move the needle. And I don't know, from where I sit on this board, sometimes all I look at is, did this district make it and did this district not? But what I think you're saying, Mike, is if you look at the state as a unit, we have more kids exiting, ready to go out in the world doing great things. We have more kids who are English language proficient. We have more kids. And I think sometimes that message is lost in the fact that we have to report out by school.
Yeah, I agree with that, Mark. It's really, there's a theory of action. I mean, if you work with the Center for Assessment, the first thing they do is you develop a theory of action. How is this going to help and what's it going to help? And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But, there is a theory of action and it's working. That's basically what I see. It's not going to help. You're not going to see, it's like moving a battleship, not moving a speedboat,
Absolutely.
but it is making a difference. And I think there's evidence of that. And, for a few years there with post-secondary readiness, I would say we really didn't know what was going on because the data quality was so bad. But now the data quality is getting so much better that we are at a point where we can tell that things definitely are getting better. And once you get the data cleaned up, then every year after that, more about what's going on. And so that's why it's important to make that an indicator, clean up the data, and then you'll start to see some progress. And that's what's happening.
Thank you.
Scott, you have your hand up?
Thank you. Thank you for that presentation. A question on going back to the English language proficiency. That is one that is very close to us here in Teton County, and I think other districts too, a lot more districts now, we have a significant newcomer population. It's a significant population in our district, which has dramatic effects on our accountability reports, specifically for our dual immersion elementary school and our middle school. The question is, not just speaking obviously for my own district, but for this from the state level, have there been any conversations on how this can be reviewed a little bit more deeply in regards to exemptions for newcomers in math and ELA for a year or two, so schools have the ability to try to make and grow and make a difference before they're formally assessed from an accountability metric. As a result of some of those metrics, a school gets kind of in a cycle of rinse and repeat because the assessment is so early for some of these students who, quite frankly, are just learning the basics of school. So I just wanted to make sure our board was aware of some of those dynamics, and in many districts in the state, I think everyone knows that Teton County has that dynamic primarily, but I just want to bring that to the surface. This English language proficiency indicator is a very important slide, and thank you for bringing it forward. I know there's no immediate solution to it, but I do think it's something we should pay attention to. Thank you.
So, Mr. Chairman and trustee, I think you're making an important point, and what you're bringing up really is the idea that there's some inequity in this indicator because many schools don't have it. They don't have enough students to have it. And so if you're a school that has a lot of these students, it's not just the English language proficiency that's affected by that. It's achievement. It's equity. It's a lot of the other indicators can be negatively affected by that, and so that's kind of where we're at when it comes to exemptions. That's not really part of accountability. That's handled by the assessment team, and Lori's here. And there's federal regulations about what exemptions we can do. One thing with the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, which was passed after the Coleman Report back in the 1960s, and ESSA is a reauthorization of that act. No Child Left Behind came before ESSA. That was a reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act also. One of the things that No Child Left Behind did, or it was even the version of it prior to that, they started requiring that all students be tested. And because prior to that time, there were a lot of students that did not get tested, special education students in particular. But the regulations coming down from the federal government have really been pretty strict about who can get exemptions and who can't. And I'm not an expert on what exemptions are possible for English learner proficiency. There is a first-year exemption, I believe, in English language arts. I don't believe there's an exemption in math. So that's part of the federal statute. So the state, that's what the state does, is they follow that statute.
Thank you.
I've been doing a lot of work on this equity indicator thing for the past couple of years. And this work came out of the work we were doing in developing technical reports, annual technical reports around subgroup achievement gaps, basically. And one thing, I watched the presentations by Marzano's group. One thing that Caitlin, I believe it was, commented on. She said, your equity indicator really isn't about subgroup gaps. It's not about students in subgroups. It's about students with low achievement. And she's right about that. Basically, the consolidated subgroup is the students who have scores in the bottom 25% of scores in English language arts and/or math on the state test. So, and I think that's a problem because one of the goals of WAEA is to minimize achievement gaps. That's in statute. That's a goal. And the equity indicator, the theory of action around how the consolidated subgroup would help us accomplish that. I mean, that's why we have an equity indicator, is to minimize achievement gaps. And the theory of action was, well, a lot of students in there are going to be students from subgroups that have subgroup gaps. So if we can help these students do better, then the subgroup gaps will minimize. So that was the theory of action. But another thing that they said in their report was districts don't really understand the indicator. And part of the reason they don't understand it is because students in subgroups are not called out in any way in the business rules around this indicator. So that's basically the biggest complaint I have with the way it's operating now. So what is an achievement gap? An achievement gap is when students in the subgroup have lower scores on a test than students not in the subgroup. And in Wyoming, we have 7 subgroups that we've identified that have negative subgroup gaps for achievement. Economically disadvantaged, which is free and reduced lunch is a proxy for that. Students with disabilities, English learners, including former English learners that have transitioned out, Blacks, Hispanics, Native American, and multi-race. And so we've been measuring achievement gaps using standardized scores that have a mean of 0 statewide. So in 3rd grade reading, the mean is 0 and the standard deviation is 1. In 4th grade reading, the mean is 0, the standard deviation is 1. So every student gets a score that tells them how far they are from the mean score. It's like, for example, say that the way you look at the achievement gap is you get a subgroup average score on a test. And you can do that if you use standardized grades or scores, you can do it across grades. So for all the students at the school. And then you subtract that from the not subgroup average score. So it's simple subtraction. You compute the mean and then subtract. And when the gap is minus 0.55, that means the subgroup scored 55% of a standard deviation lower than students not in the subgroup. And so is minus 55%? Is that a small gap or a large gap? You know, that's a question to give some context to what this gap, how big this gap is. Well, so you can use these rules of thumb for interpreting effect sizes, basically, which is what the mean standard scores are. So if it's less than 0.10, it's tiny. 0.10 to 0.02, very small, and so on. So you can see that a gap of 50.50, which is like 50% of a standard deviation, that's a moderate gap. That's a pretty big gap in education, really. That you don't see gaps like or effect sizes like that very often. And then so what this table does is I had 4 years of data for every subgroup statewide across all grades. And for free and reduced lunch math, their widest gap over those 4 years was 56.0% of a standard deviation. Their narrowest gap was 54.9% of a standard deviation. So I subtracted the narrowest gap from the widest gap and I got 1.1. So 1.1% of a standard deviation, that's how much the gap has changed in all that time. It's tiny, it's a tiny change. And 32% of students in Wyoming that were tested were in that subgroup. Then you can see for students with disabilities, that's about 13.5% of students in the state. And their difference in gaps were tiny also. They're not really changing much. They're pretty stable. They're staying about the same. And you can see that they're about 110% of a standard deviation below the mean score. So they have the largest gap. They have quite a large gap. And then you get English learners. That's how you interpret that. The only place where we saw something that was a little bit different was Native American. There was about a 25% change in gap. And that was like from the 2018-19 before the pandemic to 2020-21 right after the pandemic. I'm happy to report that it's moving back down now towards where it was prior to the pandemic. It hasn't got there yet, but it is starting to move back. The other thing to notice, like for Blacks, that's 1% of students in the state are Black. There aren't very many students in that subgroup, so you're you might see more fluctuation in the gaps for that subgroup. But anyhow, this is some of the data that we're starting to look at regularly at the department now. So this is basically what I'm recommending. To stop using the consolidated subgroup, the bottom 25% of students for the equity indicator, and start using what I'm calling it a super subgroup. People are nationally talk about a super subgroup. I called it that just so you know it's not the same thing as the consolidated subgroup, basically. And students would be identified if they're in one or more of the 7 low gap subgroups, negative gap subgroups. And they're below proficient on the prior year state test. So those would be the 2 ways that we would identify them. And if we do that, 100% of students in the super subgroup are in a negative gap subgroup. 24% of members of the consolidated subgroup are not. So this slide basically compares super subgroup with consolidated subgroup, and you can see 50 schools have a missing indicator with the consolidated subgroup. Only 18 schools have a missing indicator with the super subgroup. The other thing, I think this is really important. The low gap subgroup is named in the business rules. So schools know what we're trying to do. We're trying to minimize achievement gaps. It's important for them to know that. With the consolidated subgroup, they were confused about. There was some confusion about that. Also, the statewide gap is not measurable. So you can't monitor progress by looking at the statewide growth gap. The growth gap is measurable with the super subgroup, and there's a technical reason why it's not measurable. It's always 50-50, so there's no gap. The super subgroup has growth, median growth percentile of 50. The not super subgroup does every year. I'm talking about the consolidated subgroup. So their median student growth percentile is going to be 50 every year. And students not in that subgroup, they're going to have a median student growth percentile of 50 every year. And then, but with the super subgroup, there is a gap and it's measurable, and it's 4 points right now. The growth of super subgroup students is -4 compared to the not super subgroup. And then the other thing is, I said earlier that indicators need to be correlated with one another, but not too highly correlated. Well, that's what the last row in this table is. The super subgroup is the correlation of that with the growth indicator score is 0.72, which is a little bit lower than 0.77. And that's a good thing to be a little bit lower. 0.77 is pretty close to it's closer to the growth score. So I want to talk about achievement gaps versus growth gaps. And this goes back to the Coleman report from 1964. Basically, it's pretty generally accepted that achievement is a measure of things that students bring to school, whereas growth is a measure of value added by schools. And that's why it's so important to have growth in an accountability model, because you're just measuring family socioeconomic status if your only indicator is the achievement indicator. And so now we do have growth in there, and it is, I think it's key to minimizing achievement gaps. So what is a growth score? Student growth percentile. It's basically, there's a method called quantile regression, words that you don't have to know what it means or how to do it or anything like that. But so it's a statistical regression method. And the students get a growth percentile score that's a whole number between 1 and 99. So those are the possible scores. And they're not real precisely accurate. There's a lot of error in those scores. So it's good to think about them as kind of generally, if their score is from 1 to 35, they have low growth. If it's from 35 to 65, typical growth. 65 or higher, that's high growth. That's a good categorical way to think about what an individual student's growth score. And then a median student growth percentile represents the growth of a group of students. So these are growth gaps. You can compute growth gaps too. Also, in addition to achievement gaps. And if you have an achievement gap, it seems like you would have to have a positive growth gap. Your growth of your subgroup would have to be higher than the growth of your not subgroup in order to minimize the achievement gap. It's just logical. It makes sense. Well, you can see for most of these subgroups, there is a negative growth gap. They're not very high, though. Some of them, like the Blacks and ELA, you remember there's not very many students there. They have no gap in ELA, and it's only -2 in math, which is good. You know, I'll show you some other information here in a minute. So that's statewide. Those are statewide achievement gaps. So that got me thinking about what's going on in the schools. Are there some schools that have super subgroup growth that's higher than not super subgroup growth? Because if there's some schools like that, we could work to get more schools like that. And if we do that, then we'll be minimizing the achievement gap. So that was, you know, the basic concept that got me looking at this. And this shows for 2023 and 2022, these are descriptive statistics about the size of the growth gap at Wyoming schools. 256 schools had a growth gap in 2023 and 255 in 2022. The widest negative gap was about over 30 points. So that means the median student growth percentile of the super subgroup was over 30 points lower than the median growth score of the not super subgroup students at that school. The first quartile, you can see there, the median was -2.0, but the third quartile was a positive number. So that tells me that more than 25% of schools had a positive growth gap. And that's a good thing. And you can see some schools had a positive growth gap as high as 30 points almost, which is a large growth gap. So what I did is I categorized growth from the lowest or the widest negative gap to the widest positive gap. And I came up with 6 categories. That's what this table shows you what the categories are. And then this is the rows in this table represent their school's growth category during the current school year, and the columns represent their growth category during the prior school year. So you're looking at current year versus prior year. And if you look at the upper left green cell, there's 25 schools in there, and they were in category 4 2 years in a row. That's a growth gap between 0 and +10. So all the schools in the green, they had a positive growth gap 2 years in a row. So that's a lot of schools that were able to have a positive growth gap 2 years in a row. The yellow ones, they had a negative growth gap 2 years in a row. And you'll see there's more schools there than there are in the positive growth gap. So then that got me to thinking about, well, how much of a difference does a growth gap make when it comes to the achievement gap? So I did a simulated school study. I got all of the students in the state and I put them in quintiles from the lowest growth score to the highest growth score. 10 quintiles. So I have school A through school J. These are simulated schools. So school A through school J. And the school J had the highest positive growth gap, and school A had the widest negative growth gap. And this table here shows the super subgroup median growth percentile for schools A through J. And it also shows the not super subgroup students were randomly assigned to these 10 schools, simulated schools. So it's not surprising, their median growth percentile is around 50 generally. And you can see the size of their growth gaps. You know, like there's never going to be a school that has a minus 47 negative growth gap like school A, or plus 43 like school J. But when you get like from school C through school H or even I, we have schools in the state that have growth gaps like these simulated schools do. And so every student that has a growth score, they have a current test score and a prior year test score. So I computed the achievement gap on the prior test score and the achievement gap on the current test score. And then I subtracted the current gap from the prior gap, and I looked at the change in the achievement gap. And what you can see is that even when at school E, for example, well, let's talk about school F first. School F had a growth gap of 0, but they still narrowed their achievement gap by 23% of a standard deviation. School E had a growth gap of minus 11, but it still narrowed its growth gap by 10% of a standard deviation. And yeah, this is a little different than your slide. I've been updating these slides a little bit. So basically what's in the bottom row on this slide is what's in this chart right here. So you can see that, you know, focusing on improving growth gaps at a school will get us to minimizing achievement gaps. That's kind of why I'm proposing this super subgroup. So the achievement, they do have achievement gaps because they all have to, super subgroup students are all below proficient, so they're going to have low achievement. But it's the size of the gap that we're concerned about. And so basically, this slide, what I'm recommending here is that the subgroup median student growth percentile should be the inequity indicator score. We should switch to using the super subgroup instead of the consolidated subgroup. And then we should use this subgroup gap, growth gap, as an indicator. So those are the two things that I'm trying to get across on this presentation here. So what you see here, every dot is a school, and on the x-axis, that's how much their achievement gap narrowed from the prior year to the current year. And on the y-axis, that's a super subgroup growth gap. And you can see there's a pretty strong correlation there. It was 0.74. So, you know, you will get a positive achievement gap by focusing on improving the growth gap. So here's the final point I think that I want to make is this concept. So when you use quantile regression to get a student growth score, you're comparing an individual student with other students that have the same history of test scores. Not exactly the same, but very similar. So you're comparing how did this student do compared to students with a similar history of achievement. And they call that student with a similar history of achievement an academic peer. And that it's not necessarily a descriptive term, but I mean, it's a good way to think about it, you know? So the idea is, okay, if other students can grow like this, what's preventing this student that we have at our school from growing like this? You know, the thing about growth scores is you can be a really high achieving student or a low achieving student. Doesn't matter how high your achievement is, you can still get a growth score from 1 to 99. So you can be a low achieving student, you can still get a high growth score. You can be a low achieving student and get a low growth score. You can be a high achieving student and get a high growth score or a very low growth score. I mean, you might have a school with high SES students that does really well on the Y-top, but their growth scores might be pretty low, meaning they're not challenging them enough. So why this is important is you've all heard the statement, soft bigotry of low expectations. You know, that was popularized shortly after No Child Left Behind came along. And the idea of the importance of the academic peer is it tells you, so if you have I'll give you a really good example right here. Okay, so I'm recommending that we start putting tables like this in the reports for schools. So this on the left here, you see school up at the top. All of that information is about how the school did. And then you have state of Wyoming over on the right. So what this is showing us is the state of Wyoming for free and reduced lunch in this content area, math, had a growth gap of -5. This school, and this is a real school, had a growth gap of -22. You know, so what this is really kind of telling the school is students that are in that subgroup, economically disadvantaged, you can expect more out of them than you are. And that's why I think this approach is important and why focusing on growth is important. I mean, we can't do anything about family SES of the kids that come to school, but we do have some control over growth. And this table, this is a school that looks like they could be expecting more out of free and reduced students, students with disabilities, English learners, and the bottom row, I can't see what it is, mixed race. We have stuff on our screen here, but anyhow, this is this is kind of the concept of before I started doing assessment and research, I was a school psychologist, and so I would identify students as disabled. And back when I did that, it usually meant they went into the resource room. And I always wondered, am I really doing the student a favor by recommending that they be identified so they go into that resource room? The reason I wondered that is I wondered if they were going to academically challenge that student as much as they could. So that was, here's I want to show you just before I leave here. Go up. There we go. So this is another report we could give the school. This is the change in achievement gap from the current year to the prior year for those students that have growth scores. And this school here, and you have the score for the student. You have their mean standardized score for the subgroup, for the not subgroup, and so on. And then you have state results on the right. But the cell that's important is prior gap minus current gap. So I think that gap could be highlighted. And I made it yellow here. It narrowed by at least 10% of a standard deviation. So I mean, that you don't have to understand all the statistics and everything to see what this is telling you. This is telling you that you narrowed the gap, the achievement gap at your school by 10% of a standard deviation to 20%, less than 20%. So, and then one other thing here, this is the growth gap at the school. And this is the cell that's highlighted, that will be their equity score at this school. You know, and we need to set target levels, like for meets target, exceeds target, and so on. And the simulated schools study gives us a pretty good evidence that we could use when we set those cut scores. And I'm saying here a -6 might even be, you know, a meets target score, even though there is a negative growth gap there. That gap is not going to make the growth gap any wider, and it might make it a little narrower. In fact, if you look at this is the same school here. It did make the growth gap a little narrower, or the achievement gap a little narrower. So that's basically my presentation. I think this is kind of important work, and I'm kind of excited about it, as you can probably tell. You know, I think this would be a good thing to do. And I think other states are going to take notice of this. But, you know, I guess my frustration is we don't really have a process for making this change.
Ellen,
I have a question and a comment. Comment is that I appreciate this so much and I understood what you said, which
Thank you.
makes me feel really good. And I think, well, it does, because sometimes, frankly, Dr. Pleachek, you're like,
I apologize.
so this is super compelling evidence of super subgroups and growth gap. I mean, it's so compelling. I don't know how we get it done, but this is such great work.
Thank you.
So-
There's two papers already.
Good.
There's a third one coming.
Okay, my question is this, and this maybe explains. How does your data reflect students who are duplicated? Because I would imagine that some of these students fall into more than one of these super subgroups.
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of students do. And that's one of the reasons why the concept of a super subgroup became popular. But I guess what I'm, you know, in Wyoming, we kind of made a decision to use a super subgroup and not to look at all the subgroups. For ESSA, they do look at all the subgroups, you know, so this doesn't necessarily reflect that. We're going to focus on, are you a member or are you not a member? And we're going to do the best we can with those kids for growth. But if you look at this table here, this tells a school how they're doing with each negative gap subgroup where they meet the minimum.
Even if it has children who are both.
Yeah, one point I should make about this is these are not just super subgroup students, because a lot of students in a super subgroup, they're proficient or above, you know, and in this table, they're included here too. So you can have low expectations for a student, and it's not a conscious thing, but you can think, well, this student comes from this family, and I can't expect them to do everything that this other student that comes from this family can do, you know. So you can have this kind of subconscious low expectation. This is the table that tells them how to calibrate their expectations for these subgroups.
Yeah, that's really powerful. Thank you.
Yeah, and you know, I think ESSA does a good job. We have to score schools for every subgroup they meet the minimum in on, and targeted assistance and additional targeted assistance are categories for the schools with the lowest performance for those subgroups. So I think that does a pretty good job of focusing attention on schools that are really doing poorly with those subgroups. And I really appreciate that about ESSA too. I mean, ESSA is really about identifying low performing schools, period. You know, WAEA is about categorizing schools, putting them in performance levels. And so it's got a different purpose.
Taylor.
Mr. Chair, thank you. Dr. Fleachek, as a fellow school psychologist, I appreciate all this data and I love it as well. I don't know, it's late in the day and there is some of it that's
Yes.
going over my head. So I can't quite be on Ellen's level and say I'm getting it all. But one thing, as I was looking through Marazano's report and on that item 3, where they talked about removing the equity indicator as a possible recommendation, the other point that they make, and I'm just wondering, and maybe you can't speak to this, but they talk about in large schools, if there's more than 10 students in this group, then it's going to impact. And I'm wondering why that number of 10 was chosen versus a percentage. And if these super subgroups address how that's still going to impact those larger schools. I see how it's obviously going to be impacting the low achievement students, but then that, I'm just kind of curious how that looks.
That was a problem with No Child Left Behind too, is schools that had a lot of kids in a subgroup, they would fail to make adequate yearly progress. I don't know if you remember those days. But can you repeat that?
Yeah, so they just had talked about how, the lower achieving students and large schools are going to be impacted. They said, if there are more than 10 students in this group, which is the low 25%.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering where the number 10,
Where the number 10 came from, that was this advisory committee.
Okay.
They discussed minimum end size a lot in that committee. And the truth is Wyoming is a small state. And so we identified how many schools, if we have it at 10, how many schools will not get a score?
Mm-hmm.
If we have it at 20, how many schools will not get a score? And if we have it at 30, how many schools will not get a score? And schools start dropping off really quickly in Wyoming. I mean, they're just not included if we make it any higher than 10.
And that's why I was wondering why not a percentage if you have such a gap between school sizes, throughout the state and in different regions, why they didn't focus on a percentage, but I didn't know if you
Well,
knew that.
the score and the indicator is like it was a percentage, but I think it's the score and the indicator. You can't when you get down below 10, percentages really become pretty meaningless. And so 10 there's a lot of states have minimum end sizes that are higher, but they don't have as many small schools as we do. And we don't even, truth be known, most other states, they have districts that have more schools than Wyoming.
True. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that.
Mark.
Mike, a couple of things. One is I really like the idea of the super subgroup. I think that makes a lot of sense, especially when I saw, and I don't want to make sure I'm not mixing them up, but you said in our current model, 50 schools don't qualify, but in this model, only 18 schools wouldn't qualify. So my first question, what's your thought about the 18? Are they just so small that
there might be one or two schools where nearly all the students are in the super subgroup.
Okay.
So there's no group to compare them to.
Oh, okay.
But most of them, they don't have that many low performing students. So they don't get a score on this. The rule is for grade 3 through 8 schools, they have to have a growth indicator and an achievement indicator, and then they get a score. And we do, make an adjustment to the weighted overall school score.
Okay.
But they schools that don't have that indicator still might be at an advantage. But there's only going to be 18 of them that are at an advantage instead of 50 that are at an advantage.
So second question, one thing, and maybe this is for Sean, I'm sure you heard me belly aching about the fact that many times when you run the school's various qualifications through the model, they didn't change a little bit, or they didn't come out of the range of a situation that might make them an excelling school. So they're still a regular, can't remember the terms, but a regular school. And I was talking to you about the idea of, is there some credit you can give the school that, made a bump? They didn't quite come out of the category, but they really made a bump. And I think this model, I think where you're headed with this, allows that to happen. Just like the point you put up there. Well, hey, you made 10% gain here with this group of kids.
Yeah.
And I think that's really valuable for us, who, maybe we have to say one more time, you didn't change your status as a school, but let me show the three things you did do. And I think that's a really positive thing, that the positive message we can send. And then,
Mark, can I comment on
please.
that? I think what you're talking about is the professional development at the school. And that's where the reporting, I talked about the school performance report, those last three
Right,
tables
right.
would go in there. And, if schools knew how to read those tables, and I highlight the important part in each of those tables, and they don't have to understand the statistics or anything, but they can see if they're making progress by looking at that cell this year and then next year. And so, I think it really, we have 4 categories for overall school performance and 3 for indicator performance. And that's where we came down. We could have 5 and 4, but we came down during all of our committee work with 4 and 3. And so that's where we're at.
Okay. Mr. Chair, if I could, 2 other comments. One, if indeed we would move toward this model, and you think about that idea of sort of setting the new cut scores, I think one of the statutory requirements is that we create stability in the model. So I'm assuming then you would use some sort of evidence that shows, if we put the cut score here, it's only going to affect 5% of the school's status change. If we put it here, it's going to affect. Is that the process you would use?
Well, that's an interesting topic. So there's a couple things in the statute. One says we need to maintain stability as much as we can. I mean, we could identify a cut score that on this indicator, even though it's been changed, so that the percent of schools in each category in the first year we use it is identical to the percent in those categories the prior year, or we could compute it both ways and we could come up with, an identical percentage of schools in both category with new cut scores. But there's another part in the statute that says that a deliberative process using panel of stakeholders should be used, but it doesn't define that very well.
Mhm.
So, I mean, it could be a relatively small panel, and we could take evidence of a little study like that and give them an opportunity to make an adjustment up or down based on what the data tells us that would give us a stable change in the cut score.
Okay. My last point.
We are gonna have to keep moving, so
Okay.
just time wise, and I don't know where we're at with all the department stuff, but we might have to wait till tomorrow because we're
Okay.
gonna be there, but go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, since there's no process, Mike, that you pointed out, why don't we just make a motion, Mr. Chair, and let's get her done.
I will say this, one of the things that the CCSSO, we could do this year. I mean, it could be done this year, but the importance of the stakeholder process, buy-in and all that kind of stuff, where'd this come from?
Thank you.
Yep.
Chair.
And I just, we're gonna try to get there by 5 and have dinner at 6 in that time frame. So just watching the clock, but I have to stand on my soapbox for just a minute, and don't take disrespect for this, but I hope I live long enough in education to where I don't see these lists of these groups, because it drives me totally insane. Because we're supposed to be equal according to the Constitution and how we feel, but yet we continue to break people down. And over my tenure in education, it's, oh my God, those poor kids are on free and reduced lunch. And you even brought it up in your presentation. So we don't expect anything out of them. We should be on individual kids and do everything we can for that individual kid. I don't care what they are. And sorry, I get passionate because I've given my speech before. I mean, we took a survey once when Diana and I first started working together, and you know, you were supposed to put down what race you were when you filled out the survey and why. What in God's purpose does that do to say what race I am? Does that mean the state board isn't gonna, if you're green, the state board isn't gonna take your comments seriously? Anyway, sorry, but I get passionate about it.
Yeah, there's a lot of problems with racial identification. You know, those categories are really getting more and more difficult to interpret and have consistency in them. And free and reduced lunch and, you know, how we identify students that are economically disadvantaged is, it's not an easy thing to do.
Well, Dr. Fleachek, I will tell you, my kids, if I would have filled out the paperwork, would have been on free and reduced lunch. And if they would have got a lesser education because they're on free and reduced lunch, that would not have been right.
Yeah,
But they could have been. My wife and I had too much pride to fill out the paperwork.
So, Chairman, you know, the whole idea is that the label isn't really why the expectations are low. It's just attitudes that we have in our society that result in people treating people differentially. You know, it's not even a conscious thing, or it might be for some people. I don't know why it is, but you know, the whole thing. If there's a way to improve having more appropriate expectations for all kids, that's a good thing. And that's really kind of what I'm advocating for with this methodology.
Okay. So where are we at for time I mean, can we do some of that tomorrow morning quick, or how are we at?
Mr. Chairman, I think you're a good place to wrap up today.
Okay,
A couple articles, they're in your packet, you can read them. They're more kind of broad visionary things about the future of accountability. This was very specific to recommendations. You now have recommendations from Marzano, the department's response. And I think that gives you plenty when you go into thinking about your goals or next steps tomorrow to do that. So
okay.
unless there's something else I'm not aware of, I
don't think
think
so.
you've
Okay.
completed a very full day.
Anything else anybody wants to bring up, or we'll close. Adjourn till tomorrow. Everybody look good with that? Okay.
So you're gonna give us an address about where we're going? Where are we going?
Flying V. The Flying V.
Is it?
Just Google it.
Just Google it?
I assume. You just go north on 85. You go over